If time is money, and money is fundamentally an agreement, an elaborate fiction we all choose to believe in, tell me, what time is it where you are, and which dimension are you currently observing us from? Comment below. Let the algorithms know you are settling in for the longest, most deliberately soothing history lesson you will ever encounter. We are beginning. I want you to take a deep, slow breath, settling into the stillness of this moment, because we are starting at a time before money, a time that requires an almost complete mental erasure of convenience. We are looking at a world defined by the most profound, fundamental constraint of trade, the coincidence of wants. Imagine, if you will, the early Neolithic, perhaps 12,000 years ago. Society is moving slowly, painfully, away from pure subsistence hunting and toward localized agriculture. Individuals are beginning to specialize, a conceptual shift of immense consequence. A potter spends 6 months perfecting a kiln and producing durable storage jars. A nearby hunter has managed to capture and domesticate 3 young goats. The potter needs meat and milk. The hunter desperately needs containers to store his surplus grain, which he acquired from a different agriculturalist earlier in the season. This seems simple, a perfect exchange, but the fundamental problem arises when the scales of value do not align, or when the timing of the need is incompatible. The hunter might only want 1 jar, but the potter insists on exchanging 4 jars for 1 goat, citing the extreme labor involved in the firing process and the high failure rate of early kilns. The negotiation stalls. Or perhaps the hunter does not need jars at all right now. He needs sharp flint knives, which the potter does not possess. This is the intractable problem of direct barter, the friction that halts the flow of civilization before it can even begin to gather momentum. Barter relies upon this utterly crucial, frustratingly rare intersection where the value assessment, the timing of the need, and the availability of the desired object align perfectly between 2 distinct individuals. When we look back at the supposed simplicity of a barter-based economy, we tend to romanticize it, envisioning a harmonious market square where goods simply flowed. The reality, I assure you, was one of grinding inefficiency, massive transactional costs, in terms of time spent seeking the appropriate partner, and an inherent limitation on the scale of economic activity. If I produce surplus grain and I wish to purchase a tool from a distant settlement, I cannot feasibly carry my grain over 100 miles. The grain is heavy, perishable, and I might arrive only to find that the toolmaker requires cured hides, not grain. The inability to easily store value and the necessity of finding someone whose immediate desires precisely match my immediate surplus acted as an enormous brake on innovation and specialization. Money, at its most foundational level, emerged not as a symbol of wealth, but as the lubricant necessary to overcome this inherent, debilitating friction of the coincidence of wants. It was the invention that allowed the potter to sell his 4 jars to anyone willing to accept them, receiving something small, durable, and universally desired, which he could then take to the knife maker, regardless of whether the knife maker had any use for clay jars. The sheer magnitude of this conceptual leap, moving from direct exchange to indirect exchange facilitated by a medium, is often understated in the grand narratives of human history. Yet it represents the very genesis of modern complex societies. The earliest solutions to the barter problem were, unsurprisingly, rooted in commodities that possessed inherent utility and were widely accepted across localized trade networks, introducing the first, albeit clumsy, form of standardized, universally recognized value. This is where we encounter the phenomenon of commodity money. Think of items such as salt, which, before refrigeration, was absolutely indispensable for preserving food and sustaining life, particularly in non-coastal regions. The Latin word for salt, sal, gives us the root for the word salary, a linguistic fossil indicating its historical role as payment for service. The salarium was often an allowance of salt given to Roman soldiers. But salt, while high in utility, posed significant logistical challenges when used as currency. It is relatively heavy, susceptible to moisture, and requires specialized storage. Similarly, large units of grain, such as barley or wheat, were heavily utilized in early Mesopotamian economies as a unit of account, a standard measure against which labor and debts were denominated. The sheer bulk of a standardized barley payment, however, made it extremely difficult to transport or transact with, except in large institutional settings like temple storehouses. It was an excellent unit of account, but a terrible medium of exchange for daily, low-value transactions. This era of commodity money highlights the struggle to find the ideal balance between intrinsic utility and the three essential functions money must perform: acting as a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. Grain failed the store of value test due to perishability and bulk. Salt failed the medium of exchange test due to weight and fragility. The next iteration of commodity money attempted to address these issues by focusing on something mobile, self-propagating, and universally understood as wealth: livestock. The transition to a cow or a goat as a primary unit of value solved the mobility problem, at least temporarily, because the unit of currency could walk itself to market. However, it immediately introduced a new set of critical problems. How do you divide a cow to pay for a basket of apples? You cannot fractionalize livestock without destroying its inherent value. Furthermore, the inherent value of a single unit, a cow, a bull, a specific breed, varied wildly based on age, health, and fertility. The uniformity required for a stable currency was utterly lacking. A herd represented massive wealth, yes, and provided utility, meat, milk, hide, but it failed spectacularly as a practical medium of exchange for the vast majority of daily commerce. This relentless process of elimination, rejecting heavy items, rejecting perishable items, rejecting non-uniform items, drove the ancient world toward smaller, more durable, and increasingly standardized tokens, often objects that were rare or required significant labor to acquire, pushing the concept of money further away from immediate necessity and closer toward abstract value. The shift toward livestock as a dominant form of early wealth, especially prevalent across Indo-European cultures, introduces a layer of complexity relating not just to trade, but to social status and the quantification of debt and penalty. The Latin word pecunia, meaning money, is derived directly from pecus, meaning cattle, demonstrating the profound linguistic and cultural impact of this commodity unit. Imagine the transaction landscape now. If I owe you a debt or a blood price, it is calculated in terms of oxen or sheep. This standard, however, was fundamentally flawed because of the inherent biological variability of the unit. A healthy, pregnant heifer is economically distinct from a sterile, old ox, yet both might be theoretically counted as one unit of livestock. The complexity of establishing a fixed, recognized rate of exchange required the development of informal but rigorous social standards managed by elders or local authorities. Furthermore, livestock represented an immense investment of ongoing labor and resources. They required pasture, water, protection from predators and disease. Holding wealth in the form of cattle meant that the currency itself consumed resources, a concept utterly foreign to modern fiat systems. The very act of saving required constant upkeep. This inherent volatility, a sudden plague could wipe out one's entire store of value overnight, meant that large-scale, long-distance trade remained exceptionally difficult using livestock currency. You cannot drive 1,000 head of cattle across a desert to purchase spices. The transactional cost in feed, water, and risk is simply too high. This realization led to the development of secondary forms of exchange that represented wealth without requiring the constant care and expense associated with living currency. Thus, we see the rise of tools and implements, specifically weapons and valuable metals like copper in standard shapes, being used as currency. An axe head or a hoe, standardized in weight and composition, possessed dual functionality. It was useful for labor, giving it intrinsic value, but its uniform shape meant it could also be accepted sight unseen as a medium of exchange. Yet, even this transition introduced problems of hoarding and inflation. If copper became suddenly abundant due to a new mining discovery, the value of all existing copper axe money would dilute relative to labor or grain, introducing the ancient world to its first crude lessons in supply-side economics. The constant search for a medium that was rare enough to maintain value, durable enough to be stored indefinitely, and portable enough to facilitate long-distance trade persisted, pushing societies toward objects that held value not because they were productive, like a cow, but because they were beautiful, exotic, and deliberately difficult to acquire. The journey toward a truly abstract, non-utilitarian form of money found its first great success in the humble, gleaming shell of the Cypraea moneta, the Cowrie shell. The dominance of the Cowrie shell across Africa, Asia, and parts of Oceania for thousands of years is a phenomenon that speaks volumes about the criteria necessary for a successful early currency. Cowries were, for many societies, the perfect solution. They were small, non-perishable, easily counted, and perhaps most crucially difficult to counterfeit. They required vast, organized networks of collection and distribution, primarily sourced from specific regions like the Maldive Islands and the coast of East Africa, meaning that local supply could not easily overwhelm demand. Their value was maintained precisely because they were exotic imports. The brilliance of the cowrie as a currency lies in its portability and its standardization. While the size of the shells varied slightly, the sheer volume of trade meant that discrepancies were averaged out. A string of 100 shells was recognizably a standardized unit of value across immense distances and disparate cultures, facilitating trade between inland kingdoms and coastal ports that might never have occurred otherwise. The widespread adoption of cowrie shells, persistent in some regions until the early 20th century, demonstrated the essential power of collective agreement. Unlike a cow, A cowrie shell has no inherent economic utility beyond its decorative or symbolic appeal. It provides no food, no labor, and no warmth. Its value is almost purely a matter of fiduciary trust, the belief that someone else later will accept this shell in exchange for something useful. This marks a profound conceptual break from commodity money, moving decisively into the realm of token money. However, the Cowrie system was not without its fatal flaws that expose the danger of fixed supply chains in an expanding global economy. As European maritime powers, particularly the Portuguese and later the British, gained access to the source regions, the Maldives, they began importing cowrie shells into West Africa in truly unprecedented industrialized quantities. This sudden artificial deluge of the supply medium caused catastrophic inflation in the established cowrie economies. The once scarce, dependable shell suddenly became ubiquitous, shattering the carefully constructed edifice of value. It was an early, devastating lesson in how external geopolitical forces could destabilize a nation's currency by manipulating the supply of the physical token itself. This vulnerability underscored the need for a currency medium that was not merely rare, but whose scarcity could be controlled and guaranteed by a central sovereign authority. The realization that value needed to be concentrated in a dense, uniform, and inherently non-reproducible form eventually led to the widespread adoption of precious metals, specifically silver and gold. This transition occurred independently in several major civilizations, notably the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and later the Aegean. In Mesopotamia, around 3000 BCE, we see the formalized use of the shekel, not initially a coin, but a unit of weight, typically barley or silver. Crucially, the shekel standardized the value of silver based purely on its mass and purity, decoupling value from the object's decorative form. Imagine a merchant carrying a scale and a collection of irregularly shaped silver scraps, or hack silver. Every transaction required the buyer and seller to agree on the weight and the fineness, purity, of the silver piece being exchanged. This process, while mathematically sound, was incredibly time-consuming and prone to fraud. Traders constantly worried about being handed lead wrapped in silver, or a piece that was slightly underweight. Despite these difficulties, silver became the currency of choice for large-scale international trade because of its high value-to-weight ratio and its durability. It was the ultimate store of value. Furthermore, the early banking structures were born out of this system. Temples and palaces, as the most secure institutions, began to hold vast quantities of standardized silver deposits. They issued clay tablets, early promissory notes, certifying that a certain quantity of silver was held in trust for the bearer. This was a crucial step. The clay tablet was now circulating as a representative of the silver, rather than the heavy, cumbersome silver itself. It was the physical embodiment of a credit, an early form of paper or clay money backed by a reserve. This system, however, still suffered from the necessity of constant verification. Every time a new piece of hack silver entered circulation, the scale had to be checked, the purity tested, often by biting the metal. This friction was the final barrier to achieving true economic fluidity. The ultimate solution lay not in the metal itself, but in the power of the stamp. The definitive breakthrough in currency history occurred in Western Anatolia, specifically the Kingdom of Lydia, around 650 BCE. The Lydians solved the problem of hack-silver verification by introducing the world's first standardized stamped coinage. The material was initially electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver found in the Pactolus River, lending the material an air of natural wealth. The genius was the royal stamp, often featuring a lion's head, imprinted on a uniform bean-shaped slug of metal. This stamp was not merely decorative, it was a sovereign guarantee. It signified that the king, the central authority, vouched for the weight and the purity of that specific piece of metal. You no longer needed a scale or a purity test for every single transaction. If the king's image was intact, the value was certified. This act fundamentally changed the nature of money. Money transitioned from being a cumbersome commodity that needed to be tested to a token of guaranteed value backed by the state's authority. This drastically reduced transactional friction, speeding up commerce exponentially. Small, guaranteed coins meant that day-to-day trade, buying a loaf of bread, paying a day laborer, became infinitely easier and more reliable. This Lydian invention was immediately revolutionary. It was rapidly adopted by the flourishing Greek city-states who perfected the technology, transitioning from electrum to pure silver and gold coinage, most famously the Athenian silver drachma, bearing the image of the owl of Athena. The Athenian silver mines at Laurion provided a steady, reliable supply, and the Athenian owl coin became the dominant global currency of the Mediterranean world, valued not just for its silver content, but because the purity of Athenian coinage was legendary and trusted universally. The power of a recognized, internationally accepted currency allowed Athens to project its economic influence far beyond its military reach, demonstrating for the first time that currency control could be a tool of geopolitical power. The Greek city-states, particularly Athens, leveraged the stability and trust inherent in their standardized silver drachma to build the first extensive maritime trade network based on currency dominance. The Athenian owl coin, minted from the rich Laurian silver deposits, achieved a level of trust that transcended political boundaries. Merchants from Egypt to the Black Sea preferred Athenian silver because its purity and weight were reliable, a foundational element of trust that minimized the risk inherent in long-distance transactions. This era solidified the concept that money was not just a medium of exchange, but a tool of political and economic hegemony. However, as trade expanded and empires grew, the sheer volume of coins placed enormous logistical strain on the mining and minting operations. The transition to the Roman world provided the next critical lessons in currency management, specifically the delicate relationship between money, warfare, and inflation. The Romans, inheriting the Greek model, standardized their coinage with the denarius, silver, and later the arius, gold. For centuries, Roman coinage was remarkably stable, financing the expansion of the Republic and the early empire. The stability derived from a constant influx of wealth, tribute, plunder, and the control of key mines. But as the empire matured and military campaigns became constant and less profitable, the strain on the treasury intensified. This is where the practice of currency debasement began its slow, inevitable march. The Emperor Nero, starting in the 1st century CE, was among the first to systematically reduce the silver content of the denarius, substituting cheaper base metals while maintaining the coin's nominal face value. Initially, this was subtle, almost imperceptible. The populace trusted the emperor's stamp, and the transaction speed remained high. The government benefited by being able to pay its massive army and civil service with more coins produced from the same amount of actual silver. However, this practice created a profound economic distortion. As debasement continued aggressively through the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE, the silver content of the denarius plummeted from nearly 100% to under 5%. People recognized that the coins were worthless tokens, leading to spiraling inflation, capital flight, hoarding of older pure coins, and a systemic loss of confidence in the imperial currency. The Roman Empire offers history's most potent early warning. The moment a government betrays the fiduciary trust placed in its currency, the promise of its guaranteed metallic worth, the entire economic and social structure is imperiled. The collapse of the currency system was a major contributing factor to the economic fragmentation and ultimate decline of the Western Roman Empire, plunging Europe into centuries of localized, inefficient trade. Following the dissipation of centralized Roman authority in the West, the sophisticated, standardized coinage system largely vanished. The period, often termed the Dark Ages, saw a severe regression in monetary technology. Long-distance trade collapsed, local economies became almost entirely self-sufficient, and the demand for universally accepted, high-value currency dwindled. While Byzantine gold coins, solidi, continued to circulate, acting as the primary hard currency link to the surviving East within Western Europe, the economy fragmented severely. Most communities reverted to highly localized forms of exchange, often involving modified commodity money or local, often poorly minted, silver pieces with uncertain purity. Barter, or more accurately, systems of reciprocal obligation, once again dominated daily life. Land and service became the primary units of value under the feudal system, rather than portable cash. A lord paid his vassals in tenure and protection, not coinage. This centuries-long monetary drought illustrates a critical principle. Sophisticated currency requires a sophisticated infrastructure. Strong, centralized authority, secure trade routes, and a sufficient volume of commerce to justify the investment in minting. When that infrastructure fails, money defaults to its most primitive forms. It wasn't until the High Middle Ages, catalyzed by the Crusades reopening Eastern trade routes, that the need for complex financial instruments re-emerged. The Italian city-states of Venice and Florence, situated at the nexus of East-West trade, became the cradle of modern finance. Dealing in vast quantities of disparate currencies, Byzantine, Islamic, and local European silver pennies, merchants needed a stable, standardized unit of account and a way to minimize the physical risk of transporting massive amounts of coin across bandit-ridden territories. Florence answered this call by minting the florin in 1252, a coin of guaranteed pure gold content that quickly became the benchmark for European trade, restoring a measure of international monetary trust not seen since the height of the Roman Empire. The true innovation in the Italian city-states, however, lay not in the physical coin itself, but in the development of sophisticated banking practices designed to circumvent the risks of physical transport. Merchants traveling from Bruges to Venice carrying thousands of gold coins faced massive risks of piracy, banditry, and accidental loss. The solution was the bill of exchange and the system of fractional reserve banking. A Venetian merchant could deposit a sum of florins with a Florentine banker and receive a bill of exchange, a written promise to pay a specified amount of coinage to the bearer, or a designated agent at a future date in a different city. This piece of paper, easily concealable and only convertible by the authorized party, traveled the dangerous routes, not the heavy, tempting gold. This paper credit note became a circulating medium of exchange amongst international traders, fundamentally a form of private money backed entirely by the reputation of the banking family, like the Medici. This system also led directly to the concept of fractional reserve banking. Bankers realized that not all depositors would demand their gold simultaneously. Therefore, they could safely loan out a portion of the deposited gold, charging interest and thus creating new money, credit, atop the existing physical supply. This was the birth of capitalization and the creation of debt as a tradable financial instrument. This shift solidified the realization that the primary function of money in large-scale transactions was information and trust encoded onto paper, not the physical metal itself. The gold or silver remained essential as the ultimate guarantor, the underlying asset, but the efficiency of the economy was exponentially increased by the velocity of the paper instruments representing that gold. The ability to manage and move this abstract value across immense distances without physical transport was the engine that powered the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. As European powers began to engage in large-scale colonization and global trade during the 16th and 17th centuries, the demand for an internationally recognized stable currency system became paramount. The Spanish silver Rio, the piece of 8, mined in vast quantities from the Potosi Silver Mountain in the New World, became the first truly global reserve currency, circulating from Manila to Amsterdam. However, the relentless influx of New World silver into Europe led to centuries of inflation, what historians refer to as the price revolution, illustrating that even abundant, high-quality metallic money could destabilize economies through supply shock. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the formalization of the gold standard as the dominant international monetary regime, particularly championed by Great Britain after the Napoleonic Wars. The gold standard dictated that a nation's currency, its paper notes and its coinage, had a specific, legally defined value in terms of a weight of gold. Crucially, the central bank was legally obliged to convert any circulating paper money back into that fixed amount of gold upon demand. This system imposed a strict discipline on national governments. A country could not simply print money to pay its bills or fund wars, because printing too much paper relative to its gold reserves would lead to a run on the bank. The public would lose confidence and demand conversion, draining the national gold supply. The gold standard facilitated unprecedented global trade stability. Because every major currency was fixed to gold, and gold was affixed to every other currency, international exchange rates were virtually guaranteed, and fluctuation was minimized. This reduced risk for global investors and merchants, fueling the dramatic growth of the industrial age. However, the gold standard also severely limited a government's ability to manage its internal economy. In a recession, a government might desperately need to inject money into the economy, but the gold standard prevented this expansion of the money supply, forcing painful periods of deflation and unemployment to ensure the currency remained convertible. It was a trade-off. External stability and trust, purchased at the cost of internal economic flexibility. While Europe was wrestling with the transition from silver to the rigid structure of the gold standard, another civilization, centuries earlier, had already confronted and temporarily solved the problem of bulky metallic currency. We must turn our gaze eastward, specifically to 11th century China during the Song dynasty, where paper money was first systematically and extensively used, centuries before its serious adoption in Europe. The initial necessity stemmed, ironically, from the success of metallic currency. Copper coinage was so widely circulated and successful that the sheer weight of handling large commercial transactions became overwhelming. Merchants in Sichuan province, for instance, needed carts just to transport enough copper coins to complete a single significant transaction. To alleviate this, large trading houses began issuing private promissory notes, certificates of deposit that could be exchanged for the actual copper coins at a later date. These notes, known as flying money, Faiqian, because they were so light they seemed to fly away, quickly became an accepted medium of exchange among merchants. The central government of the Song dynasty recognized the utility and the inherent danger of uncontrolled private note issuance and nationalized the system, issuing official governmental paper currency backed by state reserves of gold, silver, and guaranteed tax receipts. This was a monumental administrative undertaking, the world's first national fiat-like currency, based purely on the emperor's promise. For a time, it was wildly successful, facilitating the immense commercial boom of the Song period. However, the inherent temptation of paper money quickly surfaced. Paper is cheap to produce, and governments facing massive military expenditures, especially against threats like the Mongols, inevitably turned to the printing press as a solution to immediate budget deficits. The rapid overissuance of paper money, unbacked by corresponding reserves or productivity, led to massive hyperinflation in successive dynasties, Yuan and Ming. The ensuing economic chaos was so severe that later dynasties, learning a harsh historical lesson, retreated almost entirely from paper money and reverted to hard silver coinage, demonstrating the profound, recurring historical challenge: how to maintain the discipline of metallic money while enjoying the convenience of paper. The European adoption of paper money, centuries later, was driven not by the bulkiness of copper, but by the necessity of financing war and national debt. The establishment of the Bank of England in 1694 represents the pivotal moment when the concept of sovereign-backed debt became intertwined with the national currency. The bank was established initially as a means for the government to raise a substantial loan to fund the war against France. In exchange for the loan, the government gave the bank the exclusive right to issue notes backed by the collateral of the government's future tax revenues. These Bank of England notes were promissory notes, a promise to pay the bearer gold or silver, but the real innovation was that the bank's backing was secured by the national debt itself. This realization was foundational. The currency was no longer solely a claim on a physical metal reserve. It was increasingly a claim on the state's economic future and its ability to tax its population. This system allowed the state to mobilize enormous amounts of capital quickly. enabling the British Empire to finance its global ambitions. Other European nations followed suit, establishing their own central banks, realizing that controlling the issuance of currency and managing national debt were two sides of the same economic coin. This system, rooted initially in the gold standard, still contained the seeds of its own eventual dissolution. World War I exposed the fundamental fragility of the gold standard. Nations at war could not adhere to the strict discipline of convertibility. They had to print vast amounts of money to buy armaments, immediately suspending the obligation to redeem paper for gold. After the war, attempts to return to the pre-war gold standard failed catastrophically, as global trade relationships had shifted, and central banks struggled to manage the dual pressures of maintaining gold convertibility and funding massive domestic recovery programs. The Great Depression delivered the final death blow. Nations realized that to combat widespread unemployment and economic collapse, they needed the monetary flexibility that the gold standard expressly forbade. One by one, major economies abandoned gold convertibility in the 1930s, embracing the concept of fiat money, money declared to be legal tender by government decree, no longer redeemable for a physical commodity, but deriving its value purely from government trust and the legal mandate to accept it for taxes. The catastrophic financial instability of the Great Depression and the devastation of World War II led to the recognition that global prosperity required an orderly, stable, international monetary system that avoided the chaotic currency wars of the 1930s. The solution was brokered in 1944 at a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The resulting agreement established a comprehensive, centralized monetary framework designed to impose stability. The core mechanism of the Bretton Woods system was the creation of a gold exchange standard. The United States dollar, USD, was the linchpin. The U.S. government promised that the dollar would be redeemable for gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. Crucially, all other major participating currencies, the British pound, the French franc, the German mark, etc., were fixed to the U.S. dollar. This meant that while the average French citizen couldn't walk into the Bank of France and demand gold, the Bank of France could demand gold from the U.S. Treasury in exchange for its dollar reserves. This system brought immense stability to post-war global trade, facilitating the massive rebuilding efforts in Europe and Asia. The dollar became the undisputed global reserve currency, and the U.S. became the world's financial engine. Bretton Woods also created two new institutions, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank, designed to oversee global financial stability, manage temporary balance of payments problems, and provide development funding. The system was, however, heavily reliant on the U.S. maintaining strict monetary discipline and the perceived infallibility of the dollar's link to gold. As the global economy recovered and American military and consumption spending abroad increased, the amount of U.S. dollars held by foreign central banks began to drastically exceed the actual gold reserves held at Fort Knox. This inevitable imbalance, known as the Triffin dilemma, meant that the U.S. could not possibly honor its 35 per ounce commitment if all foreign central banks simultaneously demanded conversion. The foundation of trust began to erode, setting the stage for the final dramatic transition away from commodity-backed currency. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the early 1970s represents the ultimate triumph of abstract, fiduciary money over physical commodity backing. By the late 1960s, France and other nations began systematically demanding gold for their surplus dollars, pressuring the diminishing U.S. reserves. The pressure reached a breaking point in August 1971, when President Richard Nixon unilaterally announced the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold, a move known as the Nixon shock. This temporary measure became permanent. With this announcement, the entire Bretton Woods structure dissolved. For the first time in history, the world's major currencies were entirely fiat. They were backed by nothing but the full faith and credit of the issuing government and the collective agreement that they possessed value. Currencies began to float freely, their exchange rates determined moment to moment by the supply and demand of international markets, rather than a fixed gold parity. This marked the absolute separation of money from physical metal. Economists initially feared chaos, but the floating rate system, while volatile, proved surprisingly resilient. The shift to fiat money gave central banks immense power and responsibility. They gained the crucial ability to manage national money supply to counteract recessions or manage growth, a necessary tool unavailable under the rigid gold standard. However, it also introduced the chronic modern risk of inflation driven by irresponsible government spending as the final, absolute check on printing money, the threat of a gold run, had been eliminated entirely. The value of fiat currency became a constant psychological battle, maintained by the credibility of central institutions like the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank. The world had irrevocably moved from money as a physical object of intrinsic worth to money as a pure informational abstraction, a trust-based accounting entry. The shift to fiat money coincided with the explosion of consumer capitalism and a revolutionary change in how transactions were physically conducted. While paper money was an abstraction of value, it was still reliant on a physical token. The rise of plastic, the charge card, and, crucially, the credit card, in the mid-20th century began the process of dematerializing the transaction itself. Early charge cards, like the Diners Club card, 1950, were initially a convenience tool for the wealthy, essentially facilitating short-term, instant debt to be paid in full monthly. The true innovation came with the introduction of revolving credit, starting prominently with Bank of America's Bank AmeriCard, the forerunner of Visa, in 1958. A credit card is, fundamentally, an unsecured, instantly accessible line of credit provided by a financial institution. Unlike a physical coin or a paper bill, the credit card is not money. It is an instrument of debt that facilitates a transaction by instantaneously generating a loan from the issuer to the consumer, which is immediately paid to the merchant. This technology profoundly changed consumer behavior. It decoupled the act of consumption from the immediate necessity of having liquid cash or checking one's bank balance. It monetized time and trust. A merchant no longer worried about the validity of a check or the exact change. They relied on the banking network. Eventually, the central nervous system of Visa and MasterCard to handle the risk and settlement. The physical plastic card itself was merely the access key to an immense, unseen digital ledger of debt and obligation. However, the system was still technologically primitive in its early decades, relying heavily on paper carbon copies, the familiar zip-zap machines, and batch processing that took days to settle. The sheer volume of paper generated by credit card transactions quickly demonstrated that this system needed to become fully electronic to scale. The massive paper bottleneck created by the early credit card system and the necessity of moving money quickly across continents for international commerce led to the next monumental shift: electronic funds transfer, EFT. This involved digitizing the entire payment pipeline, making money purely an instantaneous flow of data. The core infrastructure of this new reality was built in the 1970s and 80s. Key to this development was the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, SWIFT, established in 1973. SWIFT is not a bank. It is a communication network that provides a standardized, secure messaging system allowing financial institutions across the globe to communicate instructions for transferring funds. When $1 trillion moves from London to Tokyo, it is not physically moving. It is a standardized SWIFT message updating ledgers in two different banks simultaneously. Locally, the automated teller machine, ATM, widely adopted in the late 1970s, fundamentally changed the user interface of banking. The ATM required a real-time, online network connecting the machine to the customer's bank account, transforming banking from an institution limited by business hours into a 24/7 digital service. Furthermore, the advent of standardized debit cards in the 1980s linked plastic directly to one's checking account, using the same EFT network rails as credit cards, but facilitating the transfer of existing money, not credit. These advancements accelerated the velocity of money, the speed at which money changes hands, to unprecedented levels. Money was now less a token you held and more a fluctuating balance displayed on a screen, a data point in a vast global mainframe. The efficiency gained was staggering, but it also introduced systemic risks. A failure in the digital infrastructure could instantaneously halt economic activity across vast regions. Money had become completely invisible, traveling at the speed of light, entirely reliant on silicon and software protocols for its existence and validation. The proliferation of the Internet in the 1990s and 2000s added another layer of complexity to the digital money landscape, fundamentally challenging the dominance of traditional, state-authorized banking systems. The challenge was finding a way to securely and frictionlessly transfer small amounts of value between two unknown parties online without exposing sensitive bank details. This was the problem solved by early online payment facilitators like PayPal, founded in 1998. PayPal leveraged the existing banking and credit card infrastructure, but offered an insulating layer of trust. It allowed individuals and small businesses to transact globally with only an email address, acting as a trusted digital escrow service. This further democratized finance, enabling individuals who did not have access to traditional banking or international credit facilities to participate in the global digital marketplace. The evolution continued rapidly with the advent of smartphones and mobile payments. Platforms like Apple Pay, Google Pay, and numerous regional mobile wallet systems moved money transfer entirely onto the personal device. The mobile phone transformed into a portable point-of-sale terminal and a digital wallet, utilizing near-field communication, NFC, and QR codes. This completed the dematerialization cycle. The plastic card, which was once the key to the digital ledger, is now often bypassed entirely by an encrypted token stored on the phone. This technology emphasizes convenience and immediacy, blurring the lines between commerce, communication, and banking. This intense digitization, however, creates massive pools of data that track every single transaction, a capability unknown to any previous monetary system, raising significant new questions about privacy, financial surveillance, and who truly controls the flow of abstract capital. The latest and perhaps most conceptually radical chapter in the history of money involves the introduction of cryptographic currencies, starting with Bitcoin in 2009. If fiat money represented value guaranteed by central government trust, cryptocurrency represents value guaranteed by decentralized mathematical consensus. The core innovation of Bitcoin was the creation of the blockchain, a distributed ledger technology that allows strangers on a global network to agree on the ownership and transfer of a token without needing a central bank, a government, or a trusted intermediary. It fundamentally solves the double spending problem, preventing a digital unit from being copied and spent twice through cryptographic proof and distributed verification. For the first time since the Lydian coin, money's value proposition is being fundamentally renegotiated. Its scarcity is ensured by algorithms, not by the flow of gold from a mine or the political discipline of a central bank. This introduces a purely global, permissionless form of value transfer that exists entirely outside of national jurisdiction. While highly volatile and currently struggling to fulfill the traditional functions of money, especially as a stable unit of account, cryptocurrency has forced central banks and regulators worldwide to confront the ultimate abstraction of value. The response has been the rapid development of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. CBDCs are essentially fiat currency issued in a digital token form, potentially offering the instantaneous transfer benefits of crypto while retaining centralized governmental control and authority. We are now witnessing a global race to define the next generation of money. Will it be privately controlled and mathematically decentralized, or centrally controlled and technologically enhanced? We have traversed the entire spectrum of value, moving from the tangible utility of a goat to the exotic rarity of a cowrie shell, to the guaranteed weight of a silver drachma, to the promissory note of a paper dollar, and finally, to the purely algorithmic agreement of a digital token. The history of money is, at its core, the history of increasing abstraction. Each transition, from commodity to token, from metal to paper, from paper to digital data, has been a painful process of learning to trust an ever more intangible asset. We began with the profound inefficiency of barter, where you needed to find a person who wanted your cow and possessed the clay pots you needed. We conclude with a world where trillions of dollars can change hands across continents in milliseconds, based on the flicker of light inside fiber optic cables, entirely reliant on the continued collective psychological agreement that the numbers on our screens correspond to real value. The physical object is irrelevant. The information, the trust, the shared fiction is everything. What remains constant is not the medium itself, but the human need for a reliable, divisible, and portable store of debt and obligation. The money of the future, whether it be private crypto or a state-issued CBDC, will simply be the most efficient, universally accepted way of managing that debt. Now, having reviewed the full arc of this history, perhaps you are ready to conclude your observation and drift gently into the restful state that awaits you. The system is functioning, the numbers are moving, and the collective agreement holds, at least for now. Rest well and dream of shells and silver. Now, as the digital dust settles slightly from the seismic arrival of cryptographic consensus, we must turn our attention to the immense, sprawling architecture that this decentralized challenge seeks to usurp. The centralized system of fiat currency and the sovereign control exercised by the world's major central banks. The history of money, as we have seen, is a cyclical struggle between the convenience of abstraction and the necessary anchor of trust. The moment the United States severed the dollar's final, tenuous link to gold in 1971, the world entered an unprecedented monetary experiment, one where trust became entirely sovereign and psychological. This era solidified the power of institutions like the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan, which now hold the keys not to a vault of metal, but to the very supply and velocity of money itself. The mechanism by which they manage this is extraordinarily complex and requires a detailed, slow examination to truly grasp the nature of modern value. When we speak of a dollar or a euro today, we are referring to an entry in a massive, centralized ledger, and the value of that entry is determined less by trade and more by the pronouncements and actions of a few unelected committees. They wield two primary tools of immense consequence: the setting of interest rates and the deployment of open market operations, primarily through a concept that became terrifyingly familiar after the 2008 financial crisis: quantitative easing, QE. Consider the interest rate, the fundamental price of money. When a central bank, such as the Federal Reserve, adjusts the target for the federal funds rate, the rate at which commercial banks lend their excess reserves to each other overnight, it sends a ripple effect through the entire global economy. This seemingly small adjustment dictates the cost of borrowing for commercial banks, which in turn influences every single lending rate for consumers and businesses, from mortgages and car loans to corporate expansion debt. If the central bank raises rates, the cost of money increases, the incentive to borrow and spend decreases, and the economy is generally cooled, often to combat inflation. If they lower rates, the cost of money decreases, encouraging investment and consumption to stimulate growth. This mechanism is the primary lever of control, attempting to micromanage the delicate balance between inflation, the systemic erosion of the currency's purchasing power, and recession, the systemic contraction of economic activity. The entire fiat system rests on the presumption that these central institutions possess the foresight, the data, and the independence necessary to set this price correctly, a massive assumption of competence and integrity. However, the period following the 2008 global financial crisis introduced a radical new tool into the central bank arsenal: quantitative easing. When traditional interest rate cuts failed to stimulate economies because rates had already hit the zero lower bound, central banks had to resort to unconventional methods. QE involves the central bank creating new money digitally and using it to purchase assets, primarily long-term government bonds, and, in some cases, corporate debt or mortgage-backed securities, from commercial banks and other financial institutions. The goal of this process is twofold. Firstly, it injects massive amounts of liquidity, cash, directly into the banking system, hoping those funds will flow out into the economy through increased lending. Secondly, by purchasing long-term bonds, the central bank suppresses long-term interest rates, making it cheaper for governments and large corporations to borrow money over decades. The scale of this operation is simply astronomical. We are talking about the creation of trillions of dollars, euros, and yen out of thin air, digitally adjusting the supply of currency on a scale unmatched since perhaps the hyperinflationary spirals of the 1920s Weimar Republic or the Chinese paper money experiments centuries prior. This unprecedented injection of liquidity fundamentally changed the nature of money. It exposed fiat currency as not just a government promise, but a potentially endless resource, limited only by the willingness of the population to absorb the resultant inflation and the international community's continued acceptance of the reserve currency status. The success or failure of QE, and indeed the entire fiat system in the 21st century, hinges on the collective societal belief that this constant immense expansion of the money supply will not ultimately debase the currency to the point of collapse. It is a tightrope walk over an inflationary abyss, managed entirely by the perceived trustworthiness of the central bank. The decentralized challenge posed by Bitcoin, launched in the direct aftermath of the 2008 crisis, was a philosophical and practical rejection of this central banking authority. Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper explicitly framed the technology as a solution to the crisis of trust inherent in fractional reserve banking and government-controlled money creation. Cryptocurrency offers two primary counterarguments to fiat: absolute scarcity and distributed verification. Bitcoin, for example, has a mathematically guaranteed supply cap of 21 million coins. This hard limit is designed to be anti-inflationary, mimicking the inherent scarcity of gold but enforced by code rather than geology. This scarcity is a direct rebuke to the endless supply inherent in QE. Furthermore, the blockchain replaces the central bank's singular ledger with a distributed ledger maintained by thousands of independent nodes across the globe. Transactions are verified by consensus, not by centralized authority. This distributed trust is what makes cryptocurrencies permissionless. No government, no bank, and no single entity can stop a transaction or confiscate the assets without controlling the majority of the computational power of the entire network, a near impossible feat for major chains. The emergence of crypto-forced governments and central banks into a reactive posture, leading to a massive wave of regulatory scrutiny. Initially, regulators dismissed cryptocurrencies as a fringe curiosity for tech enthusiasts or criminals. However, as the market capitalization soared into the trillions, and as sophisticated financial products like stablecoins and decentralized finance, DeFi, emerged, the threat to monetary sovereignty became undeniable. Stablecoins, in particular, represented an immediate, profound threat. These are digital tokens pegged 1.1 to a fiat currency, usually the USD, often backed by reserves of short-term government debt or cash. They replicate the convenience of fiat money transfer, but exist entirely outside the traditional banking regulatory perimeter, offering instantaneous, borderless transfers without the involvement of banks or SWIFT. If stablecoins achieved widespread adoption for daily payments, they could effectively create a parallel monetary system operating beyond the reach of capital controls, AML, anti-money laundering, regulations, and sanctions enforcement. This led to an intense regulatory push known as the integration or suppression phase. Governments worldwide began imposing strict KYC, Know Your Customer, and AML requirements on centralized crypto exchanges, essentially forcing the on-ramps and off-ramps back into the traditional financial system's surveillance regime. Taxation became another crucial tool. Treating crypto as property rather than currency allowed states to assert authority and track gains. This regulatory dance is not about understanding the technology. It is about maintaining the supremacy of the sovereign currency and the power structures built atop it. The most direct and powerful response from the centralized system to the crypto challenge is the rapid development and exploration of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs. A CBDC is often conceptually mistaken for just another form of digital payment like PayPal or a banking app, but the difference is fundamental and profound. Currently, when you use a bank card, the money transferred is a liability of a commercial bank. If that bank fails, your funds are only protected up to an insurance limit, like FDIC in the U.S. A CBDC, however, would be a direct liability of the central bank itself. It would be central bank money, circulating digitally, available to the public. The motivations behind this pivot are varied, but center on control, efficiency, and geopolitical strategy. On the control side, a CBDC offers the government the ability to bypass the commercial banking system entirely for certain functions, potentially allowing for direct, instantaneous distribution of government stimulus, or, more controversially, allowing for the imposition of negative interest rates directly on user accounts to discourage saving. It offers unprecedented transactional visibility, eliminating the anonymity often associated with physical cash and providing the state with real-time data on economic activity. Geopolitically, the motivation is even clearer. If a nation like China successfully implements a fully functional digital yuan, CNY, and encourages its use internationally, it provides a means to bypass the U.S. dollar-dominated global clearing system, SWIFT, and undermine the power of American financial sanctions. The creation of CBDCs is therefore not merely a technological upgrade. It is a defensive maneuver to reassert monetary sovereignty in a world increasingly moving toward borderless digital value transfer. The ultimate consequence of this digital friction, the battle between decentralized crypto and centralized CBDCs, is the transformation of debt itself. Money, particularly fiat money, is essentially formalized debt, a promise from the issuer to the holder. In the modern economy, almost all money is created through the act of lending. When a bank grants a loan, it simultaneously creates a deposit in the borrower's account, injecting new money into the system. This means that our entire global economy functions on an inverted pyramid of debt. Central banks manage the apex, controlling the creation of high-powered money, reserves, and commercial banks manage the vast base, creating broad money, deposits through lending. The scale of global sovereign debt, debt held by national governments, now surpasses historical peacetime records, reaching levels where traditional repayment seems mathematically impossible. This suggests that modern fiat money has evolved into less of a medium for exchange of goods and more of a mechanism for deferring and managing overwhelming societal debt. QE in this context, is not just economic stimulus. It is a sophisticated, non-default means of debt monetization. The central bank essentially buys its government's debt, keeping interest rates low and preventing the fiscal system from collapsing under the weight of its obligations. The value of the currency, therefore, is increasingly defined by the market's calculation of how long this deferral can last before inflationary pressure forces a political confrontation. The history we are watching unfold is one of value being stretched and strained, forced to accommodate exponentially growing liabilities, testing the limits of collective belief. This brings us back, cyclically, to the Roman experience. When the costs of empire exceed the ability to collect taxes or extract tribute, the currency itself becomes the last resource to be debased and consumed. We are witnessing this debasement, but executed not through clipping silver, but through the endless generation of digital zeros and ones, managed by algorithms and central banking committees seeking to defy the fundamental economic laws of scarcity. The complexity is immense, the stakes are existential, and the sheer volume of data and interconnected liability creates a system both incredibly efficient and terrifyingly fragile. We have moved far beyond the simple trade of goats for pots. We now trade in promises of eternal economic growth and managed debt stability, promises that require continuous global coordination to prevent catastrophic failure. But the story of money is incomplete without a deeper examination of the hidden infrastructure that ensures this massive flow of digital value can cross borders smoothly and reliably. An infrastructure that few outside the financial elite ever contemplate, yet one that dictates the movement of geopolitical power, the international clearing and settlement systems. While the dollar is the global reserve currency, the physical transfer of value across sovereign borders, whether it be fiat or even major crypto transactions, relies upon a layered system of interbank messaging and liquidity provision. The centerpiece, as we briefly mentioned, is SWIFT, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. SWIFT is the nervous system of global finance, but it is not the actual mechanism of money transfer. It is a highly secure network that carries the instructions, the authenticated messages between banks detailing who owes whom and how much. When Bank A in London wants to send $100 million to Bank B in Singapore, a SWIFT message is sent. But the actual money movement relies on Bank A and Bank B having established correspondent banking relationships, often requiring both to maintain accounts in a common central location, frequently New York, to clear dollar transactions through the U.S. Federal Reserve's own clearing mechanisms. This layered complexity means that virtually any major transaction denominated in the global reserve currency, the dollar, must, at some point, touch the U.S. financial system, granting Washington unparalleled power to monitor, restrict, or sanction specific transactions or entire nations. This is the concept known as the weaponization of finance, a phenomenon that has dominated geopolitical strategy since the turn of the millennium. By controlling the primary clearing rails, especially the dollar's dominance via correspondent banking, and the messaging network, SWIFT, a few powerful nations can enforce their foreign policy objectives by threatening to sever a rogue state or institution from the global financial matrix. The clearest demonstration of this was the successful exclusion of Iran from SWIFT, which effectively crippled its ability to conduct international oil sales and deeply impacted its economy. However, the overuse of this financial weapon has spurred a profound global reaction, accelerating the search for alternative systems and signaling a crucial shift in the history of money, a deliberate attempt to bypass the dominant monetary sovereign. This defensive reaction is threefold: the push for indigenous national payment systems, the frantic development of CBDCs specifically for cross-border settlement, and the increasing usage of large-scale commodity swaps settled in non-dollar currencies, petroyuan, petro-ruble. China, deeply aware of its vulnerability to U.S. financial sanctions, has been the most aggressive in developing alternative infrastructure. Its establishment of CEPs, cross-border interbank payment system, is a direct, albeit currently smaller, competitor to SWIFT, specifically designed to facilitate global clearing of the yuan without relying on the U.S. correspondent network. Similarly, Russia developed SPFS, System for Transfer of Financial Messages. These national systems, while offering localized protection, still struggle with liquidity and universal acceptance compared to the dollar's ubiquity. This leads directly back to the CBDC arms race. The next great technological leap in cross-border finance is the concept of a multi-CBDC platform, where central banks can settle instantly and directly with each other using digital tokens, eliminating the need for correspondent banks, long settlement delays, and the exposure to the sanctions regime of a third-party reserve currency holder. This evolution promises to drastically reduce the cost and time of international commerce, but risks fracturing the global financial system into competing, technology-defined blocks, potentially leading to a fragmentation of global liquidity and a return to the friction of incompatible monetary standards that plagued the early Middle Ages. The very concept of money as a universal, stabilizing force is being tested by this geopolitical, technological schism, threatening to undermine the very principles of interconnected trust that the Bretton Woods system sought to establish 70 years ago. Furthermore, we must consider the rise of non-bank financial intermediaries, NBFIs, the so-called shadow banking system, which operates globally with less regulatory scrutiny than traditional commercial banks. These entities, hedge funds, money market funds, specialized lending institutions, have become colossal providers of credit and liquidity, particularly in short-term markets. They facilitate complex financial derivatives and short-term corporate funding, operating outside the central bank's direct control over deposit creation. The growth of the shadow banking sector represents a massive increase in abstract systemic risk, as their leveraged operations are often opaque and lack the explicit safety nets, deposit insurance, access to the central bank's liquidity window that stabilize commercial banks. During periods of stress, such as the 2008 crisis or the 2020 pandemic volatility, it is the shadow banking system that often freezes first, necessitating massive emergency interventions by central banks to provide dollar liquidity to the globe, thereby further solidifying the dollar's role as the ultimate crisis-era safe haven, even as nations actively seek to escape its dominance during peacetime. This inherent paradox, seeking to escape the dollar while needing it most during a panic, maintains the current structure of power, tethering the global economy to the inflationary policies of the single, hegemonic central bank. The history of money, in this modern context, is therefore a story of competing technologies of control and decentralization. On one side, we have the immense institutional weight of the fiat system, using QE and sanctions to manage debt and project power, rapidly adopting CBDCs to maintain surveillance and control over digital payments. On the other side, we have the decentralized, permissionless ideal of cryptocurrency, attempting to build a parallel system of value based on mathematical trust and algorithmic scarcity. The outcome of this struggle will define not just how we transact, but who holds the ultimate power over economic fate, the sovereign state or the distributed protocol. The next monumental shift, which is already underway, will be the widespread integration of these technologies into daily life, moving money from a financial instrument into an embedded, invisible layer of every single human interaction, transforming our privacy, our politics, and our concept of value itself, a vast, complex stage that demands our continued, detailed observation. The narrative of money is accelerating, and the final destination remains shrouded in coded consensus and centralized control. We must prepare ourselves for the next phase of this profound, ongoing revolution. The accelerating convergence of money and data, catalyzed by the friction between centralized fiat control and decentralized crypto innovation, leads us inexorably toward a future where the line between a monetary transaction and a simple data transfer effectively vanishes. This integration is creating a paradigm shift in the fundamental nature of privacy, surveillance, and economic autonomy, a phase we might term the era of hyper-monetized data. If we agree that modern money is pure information, a series of zeros and ones on a ledger, then the next logical step is for that informational value to become inherently and inseparably embedded within every digital interaction, transforming the underlying Internet itself from a network of communication into a network of continuous value exchange. This shift is most clearly illustrated by the concept of programmable money, a feature inherent in both sophisticated smart contract blockchains and, chillingly, in advanced CBDC designs. Programmable money allows the issuer, whether a protocol or a central bank, to embed specific rules and conditions directly into the digital currency itself. Imagine a digital dollar issued by the central bank that is programmed to expire, if not spent, within a specific geographical zone, or a stimulus payment token that can only be used to purchase specific categories of goods, e.g., healthcare or education, and is invalid for others, e.g., alcohol or foreign luxury goods. This capability grants the issuer unprecedented granularity of control over the velocity and destination of money, transforming fiscal policy from broad, slow-moving levers, like taxation or interest rates, into instantaneous, targeted, and enforceable directives. While proponents argue this allows for hyper-efficient social engineering and crisis management, e.g., ensuring targeted aid reaches the intended recipients without leakage, critics point to the absolute erosion of financial autonomy and privacy. The fungibility of money, the principle that one unit of currency is interchangeable with any other and free of history, is fundamentally destroyed when the money itself is traceable, conditional, and potentially perishable. The decentralized world, meanwhile, utilizes programmability through smart contracts, self-executing agreements where the terms are written directly into code on a blockchain. This allows for entirely new forms of financial intermediation, without the need for traditional legal contracts or trusted third parties. Escrow services, lending, insurance, and complex derivatives can all be executed automatically when predefined conditions are met. This capability has fueled the rapid, albeit volatile, growth of decentralized finance, actually DeFi, which seeks to recreate the entire financial system using trustless code rather than relying on regulated, centralized institutions. DeFi challenges the state's monopoly on financial services by offering global, 24/7 access to services like lending and yield generation, often bypassing traditional KYC procedures. This creates a critical tension. The centralized system seeks total visibility and control over transactional flow, while DeFi aims to create pockets of financial freedom and anonymity enforced by cryptography. The regulatory battleground of the future will not be over controlling the physical banking system, but over controlling the digital portals, the wallets, where this programmable value is stored and exchanged, and the underlying protocols that govern their behavior. Furthermore, the rise of money as pure, programmable information leads to the inevitable expansion of the concept of value beyond traditional monetary tokens. The emergence of non-fungible tokens, NFTs, demonstrates the power of the blockchain to assign unique, verifiable digital ownership to virtually any digital asset. Art, music, land titles, and increasingly personal data. This creates entirely new asset classes and monetization streams. Imagine a world where your medical records, your educational transcripts, or your intellectual property are securely tokenized on a blockchain. You, the owner, retain complete control over access, and any request to view or use that data could trigger an instantaneous micro-monetary payment, a microtransaction, directly to your wallet via a programmed smart contract. This introduces the concept of the data dividend, where individuals are finally compensated for the massive streams of personal information currently harvested for free by centralized tech giants. This merging of value and data is driving the construction of the metaverse, or the next iteration of the Internet, where virtual economies are fully intertwined with real-world financial systems. Within these immersive digital environments, ownership, represented by NFTs, and exchange, facilitated by cryptocurrencies or specialized tokens, are inherent and continuous. Money ceases to be something you consciously pull out to transact. It becomes a seamless flow of value woven into the fabric of daily digital life. Every click, every viewing of an advertisement, every piece of content created, every virtual asset acquired, potentially generates or requires a microtransaction. This level of continuous, embedded monetization dramatically increases the velocity of money and the sheer volume of transactional data being generated globally. The challenge this presents to centralized monetary authorities is not just regulatory, but existential. How do central banks manage inflation when value is being created and exchanged across hundreds of localized, borderless, tokenized, and instantly settling digital ecosystems? How do they enforce tax compliance when millions of citizens are earning micro-income from decentralized protocols or trading tokenized assets across jurisdictions in real time? The sheer scale and speed of this hyper-monetized data stream threaten to overwhelm traditional regulatory frameworks that rely on national boundaries, quarterly reports, and slow batch processed transaction data. The response will likely involve the creation of highly sophisticated, AI-driven surveillance and analysis systems within the centralized domain. CBDCs, coupled with AI analytics, would allow central banks and treasuries to achieve a level of economic surveillance that monitors financial flows in real time, instantly flagging anomalies, enforcing regulatory compliance, and managing systemic risk. The history of money is thus transitioning into a new battleground, the algorithmic war for control over information and its resulting value. This brings us to a crucial, often overlooked element of the history of money: the evolution of trust in times of systemic crisis. Every shift from commodity to coin, from metal to paper, from paper to digital, was ultimately triggered by a failure of trust in the previous system, usually exacerbated by war, inflation, or political collapse. The current global system, anchored by the massive expansion of debt and the policy of constant QE, is inherently positioned for the next crisis of trust. Should a major fiat currency experience a severe, sustained inflationary spiral, or should a massive sovereign debt default occur, the public would seek immediate refuge in alternatives. In previous eras, this meant hoarding gold, silver, or foreign currency. In the coming age, the flight from fiat would likely accelerate into the permissionless sanctuary of decentralized protocols. The history of the future, therefore, hinges on which system proves more resilient and trustworthy when the inevitable crisis hits: the transparent, but volatile, scarcity of the blockchain, or the controlled, opaque, and infinitely expandable promise of the central bank. The final defining aspect of money's history is its intimate link with human identity and social structure. In primitive societies, wealth, cattle, grain defined status and capability. In the coin age, controlling the minting process defined sovereign power. In the fiat age, access to credit defines opportunity. In the hyper-monetized data age, access to and control over one's own data assets, and the ability to transact seamlessly within the digital realms, will define economic citizenship. Those without access to digital infrastructure or the necessary cryptographic keys risk becoming financial outcasts, excluded from the seamless digital economy, relegated to a cash-only periphery. The digital divide becomes a monetary chasm. As we settle into the long night of this historical transition, the only certainty is that the agreement continues. The zeros and ones continue to flow, and the quiet, persistent question remains: in this new world of programmable value, who holds the ultimate key to the digital ledger of human endeavor? The history is still being written, with every transaction, every line of code, and every regulatory decree. The process is ongoing, demanding our quiet, attentive observation deep into the stillness of the night. The deepening integration of finance, data, and geopolitical power structures necessitates a thorough examination of how the physical security apparatus, the legacy institutions designed to protect hard assets and nation-states, is adapting, or failing to adapt, to the challenge of purely abstract digitized value. The transition from physical money to digital money has moved the battleground from bank vaults and trade routes to the intricate, invisible architecture of the Internet and the computational power centers. This shift introduces entirely new classes of risk: systemic fragility, cyber warfare, and the complex challenge of securing cryptographic sovereignty. When wealth was stored primarily in gold or silver, the threats were piracy, banditry, and state seizure. physical risks requiring physical defense, armies, navies, and fortifications. The advent of paper money and centralized banking shifted the vulnerability to the political domain, hyperinflation, debt default, and centralized fraud, embezzlement. Today, with money existing as an entry in a global distributed database, the vulnerability is computational and network-based. The modern bank heist is no longer a break-in. It is a meticulously crafted intrusion into a SWIFT terminal or a compromise of a distributed ledger key. The scale of potential theft has grown exponentially, limited only by the speed of computation and the size of the network. We are now in an era where trillions of dollars can be theoretically stolen or frozen, not by tanks, but by sophisticated code executed across continents in a matter of seconds. The greatest systemic risk lies in the increasing interdependence of the financial system and the foundational digital infrastructure, electricity grids, fiber optic cables, and satellite communications. A large-scale, coordinated cyber attack on key nodes of the global payment architecture, targeting the core settlement mechanisms of the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, or the major card networks like Visa and MasterCard, could trigger an instantaneous liquidity freeze, effectively halting global commerce. Unlike a physical bank run, which is limited by the speed at which people can physically withdraw cash, a digital freeze is instant and total. The perceived stability of the entire fiat system relies on the assumption of uninterrupted network uptime and cryptographic integrity. The reality is that this complex layered digital infrastructure is perpetually under attack, meaning the entire global economy is operating on a state of controlled, permanent cyber war vulnerability. Central banks and national security agencies have thus been forced to redefine monetary defense. It is no longer about maintaining a gold reserve. It is about maintaining cyber resilience and data integrity. Nations now invest billions in defending their core financial data, treating the integrity of ledger entries as a critical sovereign asset. This necessity feeds back into the CBDC conversation. One of the core arguments for a state-issued digital currency is the ability for the central bank to control the underlying technology stack, guaranteeing a highly resilient, government-controlled payment rail that is supposedly invulnerable to the exploits and regulatory gaps found in private payment networks or decentralized systems. Conversely, the decentralized system faces its own unique security challenges, fundamentally rooted in the concept of custody. In the fiat system, if you lose your bank card or forget your password, the bank can verify your identity and restore access to your funds. The institution is the custodian. In the decentralized world, particularly with cryptocurrencies, the individual is the sole custodian of their wealth via private cryptographic keys, a seed phrase. Losing these keys means permanent, irreversible loss of funds. This radical transfer of responsibility from the institution to the individual represents a profound, demanding evolution in financial literacy and security practice. It is the purest form of financial autonomy, but it is also unforgiving. The human element, forgetting a password, falling for a phishing scam, or accidental device failure, becomes the single greatest point of systemic failure for the individual wealth holder. The history of decentralized money is already littered with billions of dollars permanently lost to the digital void. a modern equivalent of ancient treasure ships sinking without a trace. This custodial challenge has led to the rapid growth of institutional crypto-custodians, highly specialized, hypersecure entities that manage the private keys for large institutions and high-net-worth individuals. These custodians act as modern-day digital bank vaults, using elaborate cryptographic security techniques like multi-signature wallets and specialized hardware security modules operating offline in underground bunkers to protect client assets. This development inadvertently reintroduces centralization into the decentralized world. While the underlying blockchain protocol remains distributed, the vast majority of circulating assets are increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few regulated institutional custodians, creating new centralized points of failure that regulators will inevitably seek to control. The interaction between the state and the underlying protocols also introduces the question of protocol sovereignty, the ability of a state to influence or compel action on a supposedly decentralized, borderless network. For example, if a decentralized lending protocol holds assets belonging to a sanctioned individual, can a national court compel the developers or the custody services to freeze those assets, or even alter the protocol's code? The initial answer from the crypto purists is no, as the code is immutable and exists outside jurisdiction. The reality emerging from recent enforcement actions suggests otherwise. By controlling the on-ramps, fiat exchanges, and the regulatory pressure points, custodians and developers, the state can exert powerful influence, demonstrating that while money may be borderless, the people who build and interact with the money system are not. This friction is defining the next phase of monetary history, the war to establish the limits of legal and computational jurisdiction over abstract distributed wealth. This war for jurisdiction is deeply intertwined with the global contest for technological supremacy, specifically in quantum computing. The stability of virtually every modern financial and communication system, from HTTPS security to bank transfer encryption, and, crucially, all current cryptographic currencies, relies on the assumption that current computing power is insufficient to rapidly break complex mathematical problems, like factoring large prime numbers. The advent of a functional, large-scale quantum computer would instantly render all current encryption, including the core algorithms that secure Bitcoin and traditional banking networks, obsolete. This is often referred to as the quantum apocalypse. The mere possibility of quantum supremacy has forced an accelerated timeline for monetary evolution. Central banks and intelligence agencies are now engaged in massive, clandestine efforts to develop post-quantum cryptography, new mathematical algorithms designed to be secure against quantum attack. The shift to quantum-resistant encryption is a complex, multi-decade endeavor that must be universally adopted across all financial and governmental systems simultaneously. If a nation or an actor achieves quantum supremacy first, they could theoretically decrypt vast troves of past communications and compromise global financial ledgers, leading to an unprecedented breach of trust and the potential collapse of all existing digital value systems. Therefore, the history of money is now being written in the high-stakes, highly classified world of quantum physics and computational mathematics, a battle far removed from the visible market volatility or regulatory debates. Beyond the technological risks, the shift to hyper-monetized data profoundly affects the dynamics of global inequality. Historically, money created inequality through uneven distribution of labor or assets. Now, money and credit are inextricably linked to data access and algorithmic scoring. In the centralized system, every transaction, every search query, every digital footprint is being aggregated into complex, predictive credit and social scoring systems. These systems dictate access to loans, insurance, housing, and even employment opportunities. The algorithm determines worth, not just based on current assets, but on predicted behavior and social ties. In a CBDC world, coupled with mandatory digital identity systems, the state could potentially utilize these scoring mechanisms to enforce social behavior through financial means. A person with a low social or environmental score might find their programmable money restricted from purchasing certain goods or traveling to certain locations. While this is the dystopian extreme, the fundamental capability, the link between digital identity, transactional history, and financial access, is being engineered today. In the decentralized world, inequality manifests through the concentration of protocol power and early adoption. Individuals who understood and invested in early decentralized networks hold vast, disproportionate wealth, creating a new class of digital oligarchs whose fortunes are managed by cryptographic keys rather than traditional legal structures. Furthermore, the barriers to entry, the technical complexity, the need for high-speed internet, and the high-energy consumption of consensus mechanisms like proof of work create a complex, often exclusionary environment, reinforcing existing global economic disparities. Money, in its latest digital form, continues to be a powerful engine of social stratification, but the mechanisms of exclusion are now algorithmic and technical rather than physical or political. The increasing financialization of everything, from housing and infrastructure to intellectual property and personal data, driven by these new digital money systems, means that markets now permeate every aspect of human existence. Traditional economic boundaries separating non-market goods, like social well-being or environmental quality, are rapidly dissolving as everything is tokenized, quantified, and traded. This process, enabled by the infinite fluidity of digital value, demands that we evaluate the historical purpose of money beyond mere transactional efficiency. Money has always been a reflection of collective values. When societies used gold, they valued scarcity and permanence. When they used fiat, they valued collective trust and the state's promise of stability. What does it mean for human value when money becomes a programmable, self-executing, surveilled data stream that constantly scores and dictates behavior? The journey from the cumbersome, tangible shell to the instantaneous, invisible digital token has been relentless pursuit of efficiency and abstraction. Yet, at the terminal point of this abstraction, we find ourselves confronting a fundamental question that has haunted every historical monetary regime. What happens when the abstraction fails, when the agreement breaks? The Lydian coin held value because of the king's trusted guarantee on the metal. The paper note held value because of the government's promise of redemption. The fiat dollar holds value because of the central bank's promise of managed stability. The digital token holds value because of the mathematical guarantee of its algorithm. Every system is a form of engineered consensus. The history of money suggests that all engineered consensuses eventually collapse under the weight of external shocks, internal corruption, or the inherent human temptation to dilute the supply for immediate gain. The vast, interconnected, algorithmically managed world of digital money has simply raised the stakes and the speed of potential collapse to unprecedented systemic levels. As we look out across the hyper-connected financial landscape, the quiet hum of servers replacing the clink of coins, we recognize that we are merely pausing between one great monetary equilibrium and the next inevitable crisis. The story of money is the story of human nature expressed in ledgers, and human nature, we know, is cyclical, returning always to the same temptations of greed, fear, and the search for an unshakable, permanent unit of value that ultimately eludes our grasp. The silence deepens, but the digital ledgers continue their silent, relentless update. The story continues. The relentless progression toward absolute monetary abstraction and the complex digital friction it has engendered finally forces us to confront the ultimate philosophical and structural endpoint of this 12,000-year historical journey: the complete and utter dissolution of traditional geographic sovereignty over finance and the subsequent emergence of global financial layering. This is the state where money and all associated economic activity no longer exists predominantly within the jurisdiction of any single nation-state, but rather across multiple, competing, and technologically defined global layers, a phenomenon far more complex than mere globalization. Imagine the financial world not as a map of nations, but as a stack of operating systems. At the bottom layer, the foundational layer, remains the physical infrastructure. The power, grids, the fiber optic cables traversing oceans, and the orbital satellite networks providing connectivity. This infrastructure, while managed by various commercial entities, is the single most critical point of vulnerability, and thus the primary target of geopolitical maneuvering and cyber defense. Above this physical layer exists the sovereign fiat layer, Layer 1, defined by the major reserve currencies and their controlling central banks. This layer utilizes CBDCs and highly regulated commercial banking systems, prioritizing national security, legal compliance, AML, KYC, and the ability to conduct targeted fiscal policy, programmable money. Its power is derived from the government's monopoly on violence and taxation, guaranteeing its solvency within its borders and its importance in international trade settlements. However, this layer is inherently slow, permissioned, and bound by jurisdiction. Above the sovereign fiat layer, we find the rapidly expanding permissionless protocol layer, Layer 2, encompassing cryptocurrencies, stablecoins, and decentralized finance, DeFi. This layer operates based on cryptographic consensus, speed, anonymity, and algorithmic governance. Its value proposition is global reach and resistance to censorship. Transactions here are borderless, instantaneous, and settled without centralized intermediaries. This layer is currently highly volatile and faces immense regulatory pressure, but its very existence provides a crucial escape valve from the inflationary and surveillance tendencies of the sovereign layer. This Layer 2 functionality often nets large transactions, only occasionally utilizing the slower, more expensive Layer 1 for final, large-scale settlement, mirroring the historical relationship between paper notes and physical gold reserves. Overlaying both of these is the hypermonetized data and identity layer, Layer 3. This is the realm of the metaverse, tokenized assets, NFTs, digital identity protocols, and the trillion-dollar companies, the GAFA and their Asian counterparts, that control the platforms on which human interaction occurs. Value in this layer is derived not just from monetary tokens, but from the ownership and transfer of digital identity, attention, and data streams. This layer is the most influential in shaping human behavior, as it dictates the user interface through which the first two monetary layers are accessed and experienced. Crucially, the dominant entities in Layer 3 are often private corporations, not sovereign governments, challenging the historical notion that the state must control the medium of exchange. The fundamental conflict in the current history of money is the struggle for supremacy among these layers. Central banks, Layer 1, are desperate to regulate and subsume the speed and innovation of Layer 2 into their highly controlled framework, fearing a total loss of monetary policy effectiveness. Meanwhile, the powerful tech platforms, Layer 3, seek to create their own closed-loop economies, potentially issuing their own corporate tokens or stablecoins, effectively privatizing the creation and management of value, threatening both the sovereign state and the decentralized ethos. This layering creates unprecedented complexities in legal and tax enforcement. If an individual in Berlin buys a tokenized real estate asset in Dubai using a decentralized lending protocol, Layer 2, that is governed by code written by developers in Singapore, accessing the transaction via a US-based smartphone app, Layer 3, and settling the final exchange in a euro-pegged stablecoin, which layer's rules apply, which nation can tax the capital gain, which court has jurisdiction over the self-executing smart contract. The established legal and monetary frameworks, built for a physical sovereign world, are utterly inadequate for this layered reality. This regulatory vacuum accelerates the pace of financial innovation, as capital seeks the most permissive layer for operation, leading to a constant, global race to the bottom in terms of enforcement and compliance. The historical trajectory suggests that temporary equilibrium will eventually be reached, likely characterized by selective sovereignty. States will recognize the impossibility of destroying Layer 2, as cryptographic principles cannot be uninvented. Instead, they will focus their immense power on controlling the on-ramps and off-ramps, the points where Layer 2 interfaces with Layer 1 fiat systems, i.e., regulated exchanges and bank accounts. They will use the technological surveillance capabilities of CBDCs and state-controlled digital identity systems, Layer 1, to monitor behavior and enforce compliance, primarily targeting transactions large enough to pose a systemic risk or fund criminal activities. However, the bulk of day-to-day, small-value transactions in the future, the purchasing of coffee, the trade-in of digital art, the payment for microservices, will likely occur on the faster, cheaper, and more fluid Layer 2, largely invisible to direct sovereign control, provided they never touch the regulated banking system. This establishes a future where two parallel economies exist: a heavily monitored, sovereign, stable economy for large institutions and legally compliant activities, and a high-velocity, less stable, permissionless economy for general commerce, innovation, and risk-taking. This dual-system future represents the final, abstract form of the conflict that began with the coincidence of wants. In the barter age, the friction was logistical. In the gold age, the friction was physical scarcity. In the fiat age, the friction was centralized trust. In the layered digital age, the friction is intentional latency and required permission. The sovereign layer, Layer 1, is intentionally slow and cumbersome, designed to enforce control and security. The permissionless layer, Layer 2, is fast and fluid, designed to bypass control. The user of the future will constantly choose, with every click, which level of friction and which set of rules they are willing to accept for their specific transaction, a trade-off between speed and sovereign guarantee. The true historical significance of this end state is the definitive severing of the link between national loyalty and financial medium. For centuries, accepting a currency was an act of allegiance to the sovereign that issued it. In the layered economy, a global citizen's allegiance becomes decentralized, shifting between the corporation that owns their identity, Layer 3, the protocol that manages their wealth, Layer 2, and the government that provides physical security, Layer 1. Money, having become pure, programmable information, finally achieves total mobility and abstraction, transcending all physical and national boundaries. Yet, even at this zenith of complexity, the narrative must conclude with the humbling, cyclical truth. No system, however ingenious, is permanent. The history of money is the history of human belief. Gold lasted for millennia because people believed in its scarcity. Fiat lasted for decades because people believed in the state's stability. Cryptography lasts only as long as people believe in its computational integrity. A new quantum breakthrough, a catastrophic power grid failure, or a profound loss of faith in the underlying algorithms would instantly render the entire digital edifice worthless, forcing humanity to revert to the most primitive, tangible stores of value once more. Perhaps, in that distant, unimaginable future, the inherent utility of a simple, durable Cowrie shell, or the undeniable caloric value of a measure of grain, will once again define the truest, most resilient form of value. We have traveled from the heavy walking commodity to the weightless flying algorithm. We have navigated the Lydian lion, the Roman denarius, the Chinese flying money, the Spanish piece of 8, and the ubiquitous digital dollar. The lesson embedded in this long, boring history is simple and inescapable. Money is not an object. It is a shared story. And the ultimate power belongs not to the one who mints the coin or prints the paper, but to the one who successfully controls the narrative of trust. The servers hum, the numbers flow. The story of money is eternally incomplete, always awaiting the next consensus, the next crisis, and the next great fiction we all agree to believe. Good night.